My name is Clara, and I'm going to tell you about a widow who cooked dinner and heated her home with the same fire, and how she did it in 1890s Montana on a piece of paper someone left behind. Winter that year came early and hard. It came in September with frost thick enough to snap fence rails, and by October, the settlement of Blackwood Creek was already burning through its wood stores, like a town running out of time, which, of course, it was. The first thing anyone noticed about Lenora Pruitt's cabin that December was that her children never cried. That sounds like nothing. But in a frontier settlement in deep cold children cry. They cry in the mornings before the fire gets going. They cry in the evenings when the day's fire burns down. They cry at night because the blankets are thin and their feet are ice. That's not weakness. That's thermodynamics. That's the human body doing what it does in the dark and the cold. Josie didn't cry. Toby didn't cry. They slept. Didn't. A neighbor named Sarah Vance came over in early December with a basket of dried apples and an excuse to warm up. She knocked, came in, and stopped moving. Just stopped. Her eyes went to where the children were sleeping on the floor. No blankets, just bedding, bare wood floor. Or what looked like it. "Are they sick?" Sarah asked. Lenora was stirring a pot over her cooktop. She didn't look up. Why would they be sick? "They're sleeping on the bare floor and not shivering." Lenora gestured. "Touch it." Sarah knelt down carefully and put her palm against the stone floor where Toby was sleeping. Her hand jerked back like she'd touched hot iron. "It's warm. How is it warm?" "Cooking fire," Lenora said. That's all she said. It wasn't an explanation. It was the opposite of an explanation. It was an answer that created 3 new questions. Here's the thing about that. Word travels fast in a small settlement, especially word that doesn't make sense. By the end of that week, 7 people had come to Lenora's cabin under various pretexts, and all of them had discovered the warm floor. By the end of 2 weeks, the speculation had split the settlement in half. Half of them thought she'd found something. Half of them thought she was wasting time on a superstition that would eventually fail her, and when it did, she'd be back to begging for firewood like every other poor widow in the territory. Let me back up. Lenora Pruitt had been a widow for just over a year. Her husband, James, had died in a logging accident on the Clearwater, crushed between 2 felled pines. He left behind a cabin that was paid for, about 3 acres of land that grew stones better than anything else, and 2 children who were too young to work and too expensive to keep alive. The cabin had been warm enough when James was alive. He was a logger. He brought home wood, not consistently. James wasn't a consistent man, and he wasn't careful with money. But he brought home wood, enough to keep the cabin above freezing on most nights, which was all that survival required out here. Lenora got the 2 children and a widow's struggle. Toby was 5. He was small for his age, small enough to make you anxious for reasons you couldn't quite name. His ribs showed. Not because Lenora starved him, she had enough to eat, more or less, but because 5-year-olds who are perpetually cold burn calories just staying alive. Shivering is work. He was tired all the time, didn't play, just sat close to the fire and shivered. Some mornings his lips would be blue. She'd hold him closer, give him hot broth, do everything she could. But the cold was relentless. Josie was 7, and serious in the way that children become serious when they're responsible for taking care of someone smaller. She'd learned early that complaining didn't change anything. She cooked with her mother. She held Toby's hand at night so he'd feel less alone in the dark. She understood the math. They had a certain amount of firewood, and that amount had to last from November to April. The math didn't work. Lenora had done the calculations herself. A cord of wood burned through in about 10 days in a proper winter. She had 6 cords stacked outside. That was maybe 70 days of heat. Winter was 180 days. She was short by 110 days, and that was assuming no waste. No cold snaps that required extra burning, no ice storms that meant heavier fires to dry out boots and blankets. She was short, and she knew it. And every morning when she woke up with frost on the inside of her breath, she did the math again and came up with the same answer. In November, a woman named Soon-Yi Park had come through the settlement. Her husband worked for the railroad, and they were moving into a cabin while he worked on a spur line that the company was running northeast toward the Canadian border. The railroad wife had a way of moving that made people watch her. Not because she was beautiful, though she was, but because she moved like someone who knew exactly where she was and where she was going. She and Lenora had met at the general store. Bennett Hollis was weighing flour, and Soon-Yi had come in looking for rice. Rice wasn't something the settlement stocked regularly. Ben had looked apologetic. Soon-Yi had looked unsurprised. That's when Lenora had said, "I can probably find you rice. My neighbor trades with people further north." She had said it just to say something, just to be kind. But Soon-Yi had smiled and said, "Yes, please." And then she'd given Lenora her hand and said her name. They'd talked a few times after that. Once about the land, Soon-Yi asked if the garden would grow root vegetables in the heavy soil, and Lenora said yes, and asked what she wanted to grow. And Soon-Yi had described something Lenora didn't recognize, but had agreed to help plant anyway, come spring. Once at the well. Once when Soon-Yi came by because her husband was away, and she wanted to know if Lenora knew how to treat an infection in a root vegetable storage cellar. They were conversations that only pass between women who aren't quite friends, but aren't strangers either. Precise. Useful. Separate from the gossip and judgment that made up most of the settlement's social life. Then one afternoon in early December, Soon-Yi had knocked on Lenora's door and said, "I am leaving. My husband and I in 3 days. The railroad is moving him again." Lenora had felt the surprise of it, the small loss of someone she'd just started to know. "That's fast." "Yes, but before I go I want to show you something, because you have children, and winter is long here. Longer than I thought. Longer than people are prepared for." She'd come inside, and Lenora had given her tea, and Soon-Yi had brought out a piece of paper. It was paper that had traveled far, worn at the edges, marked with stains from a long journey across an ocean. On it was a drawing. Not an artist's drawing, an engineer's drawing. Precise lines, measurements marked, little notes in English and in Korean. Soon-Yi had pointed to different parts of the diagram as she talked. Her English was careful and limited, but her meaning was absolute. "In Korea," she'd said, "we do not have so much wood. So we make the floor do 2 things. You cook here." She pointed to one end of the diagram, "and the heat, the smoke, the hot air, it goes down, under the floor, through these channels." She traced a finger along parallel lines in the diagram. "The stone eats the heat, and then the stone gives it to your children all night. All day. The floor is the bed. The floor is the heat. One fire, everything." Lenora had stared at the drawing. The principle was simple. The execution looked precise. The channels had to be the right size. The slope had to encourage smoke to travel underneath. The stone had to be flat enough to work as a sleeping surface and thick enough to hold heat without cracking. "Does it work?" Lenora had asked. "Yes. In Korea, yes, very much it works. My mother's house, my grandmother's house. In winter we sleep on the warm floor, and the food is warm, and one fire does everything. Very good system. It would need a lot of stone." "Yes, but stone is free. Wood is expensive. Yes, in Korea, wood is very expensive. Here you have trees. We do not. But you have stone. You have river stones, mountain stones, good stones for this. She'd left the drawing with Lenora. She'd left it deliberately, pressing it into her hands and saying, in case the winter is very long. 3 days later, she was gone. Lenora had kept the drawing. She'd unfolded it sometimes and looked at it while the children slept, and the fire burned through precious wood. And she'd thought about Sun Yi's voice. One fire. Everything. By late November, Lenora had decided. She didn't talk about it. She didn't ask anyone's opinion. She didn't post notice or explain her reasoning. She simply started gathering stone. River stones from the bed of Clearwater Creek, loaded onto a hand cart that she pulled herself because she didn't have a horse, and she didn't want to ask for help. Flat stones. Dense stones. Stones that looked like they had weight in their purpose. Otis Drummond saw her doing this and rode out to the creek to ask what she was up to. Lenora was loading another stone onto the cart, and she didn't look up when she heard his horse. "You're going to break yourself hauling rock," Otis said. He was a thick-necked man with a voice that commanded to be listened to, the voice of someone who'd never had to doubt he'd be heard. He'd been kind to James. He'd been less kind to James's widow. "Probably," Lenora said. "What's it for?" "The cabin." "What part of the cabin?" Lenora straightened up, and that's when she finally looked at him. Her hands were covered in creek mud and stone dust. Her hair was falling out of its braid. She didn't look like a woman who was going to explain herself. "The floor," she said. Otis laughed. He didn't laugh because it was funny. He laughed because he didn't understand, and in the settlement, not understanding was the same as something being foolish. "You're going to rebuild your floor with river rock? In the middle of winter?" "Yes." "Why?" "Because I'm short on firewood and I have 2 children. And I remembered something someone showed me." Otis stopped laughing. He looked at her for a long moment, the way a man looks at something that's broken, and he's not sure if he's responsible for fixing it. "Lenora," he said, "if this is about not having a man around to help with the heavy work, I've said before that there are solutions. You're young. I'm digging up my floor," Lenora said. "And if you're offering to help, you can start loading stones. If you're not, I'd appreciate if you'd move your horse so I can get the cart through." Otis moved his horse. What happened next was unspoken, but clear. The widow was doing something strange and important enough that she'd look foolish in front of the whole settlement to do it. By early December, she'd dug up most of her cabin floor. That sounds simple until you understand what it means. The cabin was 18 feet by 20 feet. The floor was packed earth with scattered puncheon boards. To dig channels, she had to break the boards, haul them out, dig trenches from one end of the cabin to the other, and do all of this while still using the cabin as a home and keeping 2 children fed and warm and alive. She did it in sections. She'd work during the day, digging and sorting. At night, she'd cover the open pit with boards and use the covered portion for normal living. She cooked outside in decent weather and inside over a small fire in a corner when it rained. She moved the children's sleeping space every few days as different sections of floor became workable again. Nobody helped her. Not officially. Not until Maeve Conley came by. Maeve was a widow of a different kind, an older woman who'd been a widow for 15 years, long enough that the settlement had stopped thinking of her as someone to pity and started thinking of her as simply a fact of the place. She was Irish, and she talked about her dead husband in the same tone she used to discuss the weather, which is to say she talked about him factually and without apology. She came to Lenora's cabin on a cold afternoon in early December, took one look at the open floor and the channels being dug, and said, "Well, this is either brilliant or insane, and I'm guessing you've done the math enough times to know which one it is, so I'm going to help you, and then we're going to pray." Maeve showed up every other day after that. She was stronger than Lenora, and believed without needing to understand completely. She'd ask questions as they worked, sweat dripping down her face. "Why do the channels need to slope that way?" Maeve asked one afternoon, kneeling beside the trench. Lenora showed her Soon Yi's drawing. "The smoke needs to travel. If it pools, it gets trapped. If it slopes right, it moves under the floor and out." "So the smoke travels instead of pooling," Maeve said, nodding. "Makes sense." "Smart woman, that Korean lady. What was her name?" "Soon Yi. Soon Yi Park." "Well, Soon Yi Park understood what the rest of us didn't." Maeve wiped her brow. "That this territory kills people by freezing them." They worked in companionable silence after that, moving stone after stone. The stone had to be flat. The channels had to be aligned right. The gaps had to be sealed with clay so the smoke went under the floor and not up through cracks into the living space. This was the part that required precision, and precision required time. And Lenora had to stop the work twice because she'd sealed the channels wrong. And when she built a test fire in the firebox, smoke rose up through gaps instead of traveling underneath. The first time this happened, Otis Drummond came by and found her trying to pull out clay-sealed stones to fix the problem. His horse was sweating, despite the cold. "Still at this?" he asked. He wasn't unkind. He was patronizing, which was somehow worse. "Maybe you should think about giving up, cutting your losses." "The seal wasn't right," Lenora said, not looking up from her work. "Maybe that's a sign," Otis said, "that this wasn't the right idea. There's no shame in trying something and finding out it doesn't work the way you thought." Maeve, who was sitting on a stone waiting for Lenora to finish this particular disaster, stood up and said, "Or maybe it's a sign that she needs to fix it and try again, which is what everyone does with every project that's worth doing." "It's different when you've got children depending on you," Otis said, and there was something almost concerned in his voice which made it worse. "Yes," Lenora said finally, looking up at him. "It is different, which is why I'm fixing the seal." "How many times are you going to try before you admit it might not work?" "As many times as it takes," Lenora said. "My children need to be warm, so I fix it until it works." Otis left. Lenora fixed the seal. She did it better the second time, paying closer attention to the clay consistency, using a mixture that was wet enough to adhere, but dry enough to hold. She tested it again. This time, the smoke went down and under and out the far end of the cabin through a small chimney she'd built at the terminus of the channel system. The system itself was simple once you understood it. You dug trenches under the floor. You lined them with flat stones, fitted tightly. You sealed them with clay. You created a sloped path from the firebox to the chimney. Then you covered the channels with more flat stones, the sleeping surface, but it had to be sealed right, the slope correct, and the firebox separated from the living space so heat was captured underneath instead of rising up. She built the firebox at one end of the cabin. It was a simple construction, stones stacked and sealed with clay, 4 feet long, 2 feet wide, maybe 18 inches high. At the top, she'd positioned a metal grate, salvaged from an old stove, where she could rest her cooking pots and kettles. Above that, the clay and stone were shaped to create a kind of hood that directed smoke downward into the channels below. The first real fire in the firebox happened on a December night, when the temperature outside was already dropping toward the cold of serious winter. Lenora had built the fire small, careful. She was testing. She was watching. She was thinking about what could go wrong. The firebox could crack if the clay seal was weak. The channels could collapse if the stone wasn't properly supported. The ceiling of the cabin could catch fire if the heat traveling underneath rose up through a gap she hadn't sealed. But none of those things happened. Instead, something else happened. The stone floor started to warm. It didn't warm fast. It warmed gradually, the way a person becomes aware of the sun in the morning. First, there was just heat rising from under the floor in the immediate area of the firebox. Then the warmth spread. It traveled along the channels. It radiated upward from the stone surface. By the time she'd been cooking a simple stew for 2 hours, boiling water, beef bones, root vegetables from her stores, the entire living section of the cabin was warm, not hot, not tropical. Warm, real, spreading warmth where you didn't need to huddle by the fire anymore. Warmth where you could move around the space and not feel your breath freezing in front of your face. Warmth that reached across the entire room instead of dying 6 feet from the flames. Josie had been watching the process with complete seriousness. She sat still on the floor, watching the heat spread. When the warmth hit full, she looked up at her mother and said, "Is it going to stay warm?" "For hours," Lenora said. "The stone holds the heat from the fire. It keeps giving it to the room even after the fire burns down." "How long?" Josie was already thinking like a survival planner. How long could they be warm? How many fires would they need? How long would the wood last? "I don't know yet," Lenora said. "We're going to find out together." "Will it stay warm all night?" "I think so, if the fire burns long enough before dark." Josie nodded, absorbing this. "Then we'll need less firewood." "Much less," Lenora said. "Good," Josie said, "because I was worried about Toby crying from cold again." Lenora knelt down and kissed the top of Josie's head. "He won't. Not if this works." And Josie, who had learned not to hope for things that weren't guaranteed, still allowed herself a small smile. What happened over the next week was that they found out together. The fire would burn for a few hours. Lenora would cook breakfast, use the residual heat to warm water for washing, build the fire up at midday to cook lunch, and then let it settle down in the afternoon. By nighttime, the floor would still be warm enough that Toby would stop shivering and actually fall asleep instead of just lying in the dark, rigid and miserable. Josie noticed the changes. "The stone is still hot," she said one morning, placing her hand on the floor where she'd slept. "It held the heat all night," Lenora said, testing it herself. "How much does that save us?" Josie had her mother's practicality. "Maybe half a quart of wood over the winter, if we're careful about it. If we cook efficiently and feed the fire at the right times. That's important. That's everything," Lenora said. Toby woke without crying for the first time that season. He blinked at his mother, still warm, and said, "I don't hurt." Lenora felt something break open in her chest. "No, you won't hurt anymore." The next night, Toby asked if he could sleep farther from the fire. "It's warm everywhere," he said, as if stating a fact about the world that had just reorganized itself. And the floor would stay warm, not hot. Never hot. Just warm. Warm enough that you could lie on it without burning yourself. Warm enough that your body recognized it as safe. Toby had never been a sleeping child. Too cold, always. Too aware of the cold. He'd wake up in the night, shivering, and Lenora would have to lie next to him and give him her body heat and her blankets, which meant she didn't sleep and wasn't rested for the work of the next day. It was a cycle. Cold night. Tired day. Harder work. More cold needed at night. That stopped. The first night that Toby slept through without waking, Lenora found herself checking on him 3 times because she was sure something was wrong, but he was just sleeping, deeply, peacefully, warm. The second night, she checked once. The third night, not at all. They had a rhythm now. She cooked the family dinner on the firebox. The floor warmed. The family slept on the warm stone floor under blankets that were finally adequate because they were supplemented by heat from below, and they all woke up without the specific despair of cold night. The math started to change. She was using less wood, significantly less. Instead of burning a cord every 10 days, she was burning maybe a cord every 15 days because the firebox was efficient, and the heat it produced was captured and used, instead of just warming the air above the fire and then escaping up a chimney. Bennett Hollis noticed. Bennett noticed everything about the settlement because the settlement came through his store, and people talked to him like he was invisible. He was counting the cords of firewood that people were buying, and he was noticing that Lenora wasn't buying any, and that most other people's supplies were looking thin. By mid-December, he came out to her cabin on an errand that wasn't really an errand. He was just checking in the way a storekeeper checks in when something doesn't add up. She showed him the floor. She showed him the channels. She cooked him a cup of tea using the firebox, and she let him feel the warmth of the stone afterward. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "How much wood do you have left?" 4 cords, maybe 4.5. "That should last you through March," Bennett said, his eyes moving across the stone floor like he was reading a ledger. "Yes." "The settlement doesn't have 4.5 cords to distribute. Most families have maybe 2. Lenora didn't say anything. She'd known this. She'd always known this. That's why she'd dug up her floor. Bennett sat down on the warm stone floor, testing its heat. "This is real," he said. Not a question. "Yes." "And you learned this how?" "Someone showed me. A drawing. A woman named Sun-Yi Park." "From Korea?" "Yes." "And she just gave you the drawing?" "She said I had children. She said winter was longer here than people were prepared for. So she showed me." Bennett stood up, his practical mind already working through the implications. "I'm going to tell some people," he said, "about this." "I can't stop you." "No," Bennett said. "You can't, and I wouldn't want to. This matters." Word traveled. By late December, people started coming to look at the floor system, the way people look at something they don't understand, but have to examine, because everyone else is examining it. Some were hungry for the answer. Some were skeptical. Some had already decided it wouldn't work, because it required work. "It's a foreigner's trick," Otis Drummond said to anyone listening. "That's not how we do things here." "We do it if it works," Maeve said back, in a tone that somehow made Otis sound foolish for saying it. "And it works. I can feel it." "Warmth doesn't mean it's good engineering." "Warmth means it's doing exactly what it's supposed to do," Maeve said. "That's the definition of good engineering." Otis didn't have an answer. A woman named Ellen Hartley came by and asked if it would work in her cabin. Lenora explained it would, walking her through the basics, the channels, the slope, the stone. "How long would it take?" Ellen asked. 2 weeks if you have help. 3 alone. I don't have time in the middle of winter. My stores are running low." Lenora understood. "Next fall, then. Gather your stones over the summer. Get your firebox materials ready. When winter comes, you'll be prepared." Ellen looked at the warm floor where children were playing. "I'm not sure I can wait that long." "You can," Lenora said, "and you'll do it better if you do." Sarah Vance came back and asked specific questions. Could she build a smaller version? Just for 1 room? Lenora said yes. Could she do it in spring? Lenora said yes, that was better than winter. Could she help explain it to other people? Lenora hesitated. "I'm not good at explaining things," Lenora said. "You explained it to me," Sarah said, "and I understood." "That's because you felt the floor first." "Then let me explain and you prove," Sarah said. Lenora nodded. "Good division of labor." A man named Robert Chen, a Chinese immigrant who'd stayed in the settlement longer than most transient workers, came by and studied the system carefully. He didn't say much, but he looked at everything. He ran his hand along the channels. He examined the firebox. He tested the heat of the stone floor at different distances from the fire. Before he left, he said, "My people do similar. Different place. Same thinking. Heat from below is better than heat from above." "Did your family use it?" Lenora asked. "Before I came to the territory. My grandmother's home in the foothills near the rivers. She will be interested to know someone here makes this system work." "How long has your family been using it?" "Since before my grandfather's father," Robert said. "Many, many years. And in Korea also I have heard this. Long time everywhere that people do not have enough wood." "So this isn't new," Lenora said. It wasn't a question, but she wanted to hear him say it. "Not new, very old, but new here." "That is what matters," Robert said. "You made it new here." The children were thriving. This wasn't metaphorical. Toby had stopped being small in the way that meant dying. He still had thin ribs. 5-year-olds in the frontier weren't fat. But he'd stopped being rigid and miserable. He was playing. Actually playing. He and Josie would run in the cabin now during the day, without the exhaustion that came from burning calories, just to keep yourself alive. One afternoon, Josie was sitting on the warm floor doing needlework, and she said to Lenora, "Will other people build this?" "Some, maybe." "It's a lot of work." "But they could be warm like us." "Yes, they could be." "Will you tell them how?" Lenora thought about this. She'd never had an inclination to lead other people. She'd always been focused on surviving herself, which was all she could manage. But Josie was right. In the way that children are right about the simple logic underneath human behavior. If something worked, other people should know it worked. So she started to teach people. It was never formal. Ellen Hartley came by one afternoon and Lenora drew the basic channels in the dirt floor. Sarah Vance asked about stone sizes, and Lenora showed her the thickness and shape that worked best. Maeve started telling people that she was going to build a smaller version in her own cabin for next year, and people asked her how, and she sent them to Lenora. The system had limitations, and Lenora made sure people understood them. "The stone takes time to warm," she said. "The first day you use it, the floor isn't much warmer than it would be with a regular fire, but by the second day, the third day, the stone has absorbed heat from all those fires, and it releases it slowly. It takes patience." "What about smoke?" people asked. "Wouldn't the room fill with smoke?" "Only if the channels aren't sealed properly or if the slope is wrong. You have to plan it right. You have to seal it with clay that's wet enough to adhere but dry enough to stay in place. You have to make sure the channels slope toward the chimney exit or the smoke backs up." "What about cleaning?" "The channels need clearing every few weeks. Ash and soot build up. You dig access points, just openings in the floor, and you scrape them out. It's not pleasant work, but it's necessary." "What if it rains hard? What if the chimney exit gets backed up?" "Then you get smoke in the cabin, or the heat backs up and cracks the stone, or sometimes both. The chimney exit has to be elevated and sheltered. You have to think about where the wind comes from and where the water runs." "Won't the stone crack eventually from the heat?" "Yes, eventually. But not from normal use. Only if you heat it too fast from completely cold, or if you let it get damaged and water gets into the cracks and freezes. You have to be thoughtful about it." She didn't sell them on it. She explained it. And she let them decide. The first knock on her door came at midnight, on the coldest night of the winter. Well, not the first knock. There had been other knocks, but this one was different. It was desperate. It was Robert Chen. He had his wife and 2 children with him, and they were shivering badly enough that Lenora could see it from the doorway. "My cabin," he said, his English clipped with urgency. "Firebox seal cracked. Too much cold, too fast. Smoke everywhere. No more heat from fire." "The seal broke?" Lenora said. "Ice inside. Water come in. Freeze. Crack the seal. Now smoke everywhere, and children are cold, and I cannot fix in night. Come in, Lenora said immediately, all of you. They came in, and the cabin was warm, and the children stopped shaking within minutes. Chen's wife sank onto the warm stone floor like she was standing on solid ground after days in water. She didn't speak English, but gratitude didn't need translation. She put her hands on the stone floor and closed her eyes. This was our system too, she said to no one in particular, in Chinese or a language Lenora didn't know. Stay tonight, Lenora said. Stay as long as you need. We don't want to trouble, Robert said. It's not trouble. It's what the system does. It keeps people warm. That includes you. They stayed for 3 days. By the second day, Robert and Lenora had organized a repair crew, 3 men with stone experience. Robert had a friend who worked in stonework, real stonework, with mortar and technique beyond what Lenora had been able to do. And they were able to rebuild the firebox properly. They sealed it better than it had been sealed before. By the time Robert's family left, the cabin was not only warm, but sealed against the ice intrusion that had caused the failure. Thank you, Robert said at the door. Your system saved your family, Lenora said, just like Sun Yi's knowledge saved mine. Robert understood. He nodded. The knowledge travels, he said. This is good. Word got around that the widow's strange system had saved a family's life, not in the way that traveling preachers talk about salvation, in the practical way that heat is the difference between dying and not dying when the temperature is 40 below and you have nowhere else to go. After that, there was less skepticism. Otis Drummond never came around, but he also stopped talking about it being foolish. Some people do that. They adjust their beliefs quietly and then pretend they always thought the reasonable thing. By February, 3 other families had begun planning to build versions of the system in their cabins for next year. Ellen Hartley had sketched out where she wanted the firebox. Sarah Vance had started gathering stones. Maeve had convinced her daughter to help her with the build. The knowledge was spreading slowly and imperfectly. Some people would understand it. Some people would try it and do it wrong and conclude it didn't work when really they'd just made mistakes. Some people would never try because they were too tired or too skeptical or too invested in things being the way they'd always been. But the knowledge was spreading. In March, when the worst cold had passed and the settlement could breathe again, Bennett Hollis came by and said, I'm sending word of this to a settlement south of here. Bigger place, they might have people interested. Lenora just nodded. How are the children? He asked. Lenora looked at Josie, who was sitting on the warm floor doing complex needlework, steady-handed and present. She looked at Toby, who was playing with wooden toys, his small face engaged and warm. They're well, she said. You did good work, Bennett said. Hard work. But good. He left, and Lenora went back to cooking on the firebox, and the stone floor beneath her feet was warm, and the children were sleeping soundly that night, and the math had changed from we won't make it to we'll make it and help someone else make it too. This is what knowledge is sometimes. It comes to you in a drawing on a piece of worn paper, delivered by a woman you've just started to know, who leaves it with you because she sees what you need. It comes from another place, another way of understanding the world. It comes embedded in the experience of people you might never meet, ancestors you don't share, and it asks to be translated into your own context. Lenora didn't invent the ondol. The Korean people had been using it for centuries. She learned it. She adapted it. She proved it could work in a place it had never been tested before. And then she taught it to other people, who would teach it to their people. And the knowledge would move outward from there, shaped by each person's hands, refined by each person's experience. This is how the frontier actually worked. Not with geniuses working alone, but with ordinary people remembering things, learning from strangers, trying something because the other option was letting their children freeze. The floor stayed warm. The children grew. The knowledge spread. And somewhere, in a place Lenora would never see, a woman named Soon-Yi Park was starting her life over again, carrying with her the satisfaction of having passed something useful to someone who needed it. That's the story. That's the fire under the floor and the wisdom that travels in drawings and the ordinary, extraordinary survival of people who refuse to let their children shiver in the dark. The season changed. Spring came. And the warm floor, having done its work, settled into its purpose, a place for children to play, to sleep safely, to live. One fire, everything. The stone remembering heat long after the flames had burned down to ash.